happen, Vincent. Like me, you probably learned this as a kid. Something goes wrong. You call 911. Someone answers. Help is on the way. That's the deal. Reporter Buyer Duncan is with Type Investigations. He spent a year finding out how often that deal is breaking. Across America's biggest cities, more than 1 in 5 911 centers can't answer calls fast enough to meet the national standard. And the reason is often simple. There aren't enough people to pick up the phone. Dispatch centers are badly understaffed, and the calls never stop. That means when you call 911 in the middle of an emergency, you might end up on hold. Bayard's reporting, which just aired on the podcast Reveal, took him from California to Wisconsin to Capitol Hill. And one thread he kept pulling on is this. The people answering those calls are not classified as first responders. In the federal government's eyes, they sit alongside receptionists and bill collectors. There's a move in Congress to change that. And this past winter, a team from Detroit's 911 center went to Washington to fight for it. For more, reporter Bayard Duncan is with us now. Bayard, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you spent time with 911 dispatchers at a conference near the Pentagon, hundreds of them in from all over the country to lobby Congress. What had they all come to ask for?
Around 450 dispatchers, telecommunicators had come to D.C. in February, essentially with the main goal of pushing for the passage of a piece of legislation called the Enhancing First Response Act. And this is a bill that has been introduced and reintroduced in various different forms since about 2018 or 2019. But essentially, it pushes for a reclassification of 911 dispatchers' job category in the eyes of the federal government from what's called administrative support occupations, basically clerical or secretarial staff, to a protective services occupation, which is more aligned with police and fire.
So why has it taken 7 years to get this close?
You know, I'm not a DC reporter. This bill over the years has come very close a number of different times. A lot of times it has just sort of stalled out for sort of Baroque administrative purposes. This time around, this iteration of the bill, for the very first time, passed the Senate last September and is now has landed in the House. It's in the hands of Speaker Mike Johnson. It's been there for several months. And what's interesting is that it has never passed the Senate before. So this was a first. And similar iterations of the bill with similar language have passed the House several times. And so when I traveled to D.C. to walk Capitol Hill with a lot of these dispatchers, a lot of them were feeling pretty excited. You know, they thought this thing could finally pass. But as of right now, it's just stopped there in the House.
I want to ground the stakes a little bit more if we could. So again, as you mentioned, right now, federally, a 911 dispatcher is classified as clerical, administrative support, essentially. You met a Detroit police commander, Sania Russell, who sees the job completely differently.
They are really the face of the Detroit Police Department and the face of every police department. It starts with 911. And so I really think that we need to give credit to those people because they are heroes. They're the heroes behind the badge.
Now, Sania's colleague got specific about what the work actually demands. This is Jamar Rickett, a retired police captain who now helps run Detroit's 911 center.
Our telecommunicators have a rigorous training course. It almost mirrors what a police officer or firefighter goes through. We have countless times where they have actually instructed a person over the phone to provide CPR. We've had childbirth where they have actually given instruction to safely bring a child into the world. We have stroke protocols, and they have to maintain these certifications, so it's not a one and done.
So that's a former cop telling you these dispatchers train almost the way he did. They're talking people through CPR, through childbirth, through a stroke. They're keeping up certifications. And then there's the government's own language from 2018 saying dispatchers don't provide, quote, actual care. Bayard, help me square those two.
I wish I could. Honestly, the part of the reporting I wanted to establish was that, back, as you say, in around 2018, the last time the federal government decided on these classifications, because they do it about every 10 years, they invoked some language that, just like you said, asserts that 911 telecommunicators don't administer actual care, talk people through procedures, or provide advice. And along the course of my reporting, you hear Jamar talk about it. I also found some examples in Madison, Wisconsin, and elsewhere of dispatchers not only deploying CPR, but actually saving lives over the phone and even tallying how many lives they've saved. And so the federal government's classification, though I think it was based in sort of a large-scale analysis of what many have argued are pretty outdated job descriptions, that may have been true at one point, that these folks are closer to administrative support occupations. But in my reporting, all the 911 professionals I spoke to are pretty aghast at still being classified this way. And that's why they're in Capitol Hill pushing for the change.
I love that your reporting really humanizes all of this. And I want you to go back to one of the dispatchers that you spoke with who's gotten awards for saving lives. Would you tell us about that?
Sure. Hannah Thomas is a dispatcher in Dane County, Wisconsin, which is, covers Madison. And their dispatch center is not far, actually, from the Capitol there in Madison. They're a small but mighty dispatch center. They probably get around 400,000 calls a year. And Hannah has been a dispatcher there for a little over 12 years. In the time she's been working dispatch in Dane County, she's racked up 5 of what they call Lifesaver Awards there, which are these little glass plaques that they mount on a wall outside of their dispatch floor. And the Lifesaver Awards are what they sound like. They commemorate a time when a caller, called 911 because somebody was unresponsive, usually for some sort of choking or cardiac event. The dispatcher sprung into action. They used their training to talk the caller through CPR, and it saved their life. And it's not just that they're sort of assuming it saved their life. They actually have a medical director in Dane County who does sort of a follow-up report just to make sure that, there were no long-term neurological effects, that the person was in the same shape after the incident that they were before it. And just since 2020, when they started keeping track in Dane County, they've got something like 102 Lifesaver Awards mounted on the wall. And that's on top of about 18 or 20 what they call Stork Awards, which are a different story. But those are when dispatcher helps deliver a baby. And there are these walls. Sometimes it's a tree of life. Sometimes it's a wall of life. It's not an official tally, but I've spoken to dispatchers all across the country whose centers have these and who are tallying this in the same way. And meanwhile, there's an industry estimate that puts the number of times dispatchers use CPR over the phone each year at something like 320,000 times. So, this is a form of actual care, despite what the government says.
Yeah, they are first responders, no doubt. And something that really shined through listening to the voices of some of the folks you spoke with, some of the dispatchers, was how mission driven they are, how serious they take this work. Talk about that.
It takes a special type. I mean, this is a very difficult job. There's mountains of research indicating that 911 telecommunicators suffer from higher rates of PTSD and depression and anxiety than even what we think of as traditional first responders like police and fire. One of the reasons for that, I think, according to a lot of the folks I spoke to, is there's this lack of closure. There's also this sort of nonstop nature of the job. Imagine you're taking one traumatic call after another, sometimes 100 or hundreds per day per shift. You do what you can and then you hang up and you don't know what happened afterwards. That takes an immense toll on people. And so, it is it's a job that is not for everyone, but the people that I met who've been able to do the job and do it for years, they have a special dedication. And like you said, they are quite mission driven.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. I'm talking with Bayard Duncan. He's an investigative reporter with Type Investigations who spent a year inside the country's 911 system. We're talking about the push to recognize 911 dispatchers as first responders and the Detroit team that carried that fight all the way to Congress. Bayard, Detroit has lived its own version of this a few years back. Reporting here found hundreds of 911 calls a day going on hold. People in crisis hearing a recording instead of a voice. And the city responded. It removed the head of its 911 operation. It disciplined staff, and it hired more call takers. And still, the staffing never quite holds. And that's here and pretty much all over the country, as your reporting has found. You found understaffing is sitting really at the center of all of this. Could reclassification fix that?
The way reclassification was described to me vis-a-vis solving the problem of understaffing was that it's not a silver bullet. It's one arrow in the quiver, which is what one expert told me. Which makes sense. Some of the issues that lead to long hold times for the public are technological, but for the most part, it is a simple math problem of not having enough dispatchers manning the phones commensurate with the number of calls that are coming in. And the way to solve that, sometimes it's like building out your dispatch center so there are more seats to field more staff at one moment. But in a lot of cases, I would say the majority of cases, certainly in my data that I analyzed, it's just that the call centers are understaffed. They don't have enough people working. And I think it's important to mention that just because a call center is understaffed doesn't mean it's necessarily going to have fewer than the necessary staff on in a given shift. What it more likely means is that it does have all the seats filled that it needs filled, but these are people who are working mandatory overtime. These are people who are working 12 or 16-hour shifts, who maybe learned that they had to work 4 more hours when they showed up that morning. And, the traumatic nature of this job can make that a very, very stressful situation. A lot of these people are mothers, people with families. Yeah. And so what you end up having is a lot of attrition and burnout, which of course makes things harder for the people who are able to stay in the jobs. And then they burn out. So it really is kind of like, this, you've got to kind of walk this tightrope. Once you're fully staffed, you can't rest. You have to be ready to replace the person who leaves. And, there's a lot of training that's involved too. So sometimes you're in great shape and then all of a sudden a couple people put in their notice and you're back where you started. It's a very difficult dynamic.
And so with this reclassification, I mean, when you think about things like support, you were talking about the trauma that folks are facing, right? When they are speaking with people who are in these dire situations. So if they have this reclassification, one example of how things would change would be it would give 911 dispatchers access to more support. For example, mental health services.
It could.
Yeah.
The federal bill, at least at first, would essentially only tackle the labor category in the government's eyes. But advocates told me that it would really pave the way and remove any sort of roadblocks for the state, city level, even local level, for telecommunicators to begin to be lumped in with other first responders when they go to the bargaining table for retirement benefits or for mental health benefits. Additionally, in places like Seattle and Arizona and Idaho, we have seen state-level reclassification, one form of state-level reclassification pass, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee anything off the bat. But then as bills sort of to benefit first responders come in the following years, all of a sudden you have telecommunicators lumped in with them, and they are able to have that earlier retirement. They're able to have sort of boosted mental health services, improved services. And there are some examples, some firm examples of the benefits that reclassification yields in Seattle and Arizona as well.
Let's discuss the other side for a moment, if we could, because like a very good reporter, you went looking for it. The pushback is about money, that this reclassifying could cost cities and states more in salaries and benefits, earlier retirement. And one think tank warned it might open the door for other public workers to claim the same thing. When you reported that out, did it hold up?
I will be honest, it was very difficult to
That's
find.
what I sensed. Go on.
It was very difficult to find real bona fide opposition to reclassification. Like I said, or like you said, there is a think tank I found that basically made the argument, oh, if this level of city employees wants to get these added benefits, what's to stop every single city employee from getting added benefits? Which I thought was, sure, yeah, I guess everybody can go to the table and try to get what they want, but it feels pretty clear to me that there's a sort of law enforcement element and life-saving element to these people's jobs. I also saw in New Mexico, this one was sort of just made me chuckle. There was a long line in one hearing a couple of years ago. There was a long line of supporters who went up before the council and basically made the case and played 911 calls and indicated that they're also tracking life saves. And then there was one opponent who basically went up and said, I hate to be the guy to oppose this, but like nobody's given me sort of a tally of how many dispatchers there are in the state. And so we don't know what it will cost. So like, that's the nature of my opposition. Like, you could change my mind. You just need to give me the list of how many people there are.
Okay. So no opposition in stone here.
Not that I could really find. And, I think in previous years, I heard rumblings, so I couldn't really track it down here in California, of police and fire unions kind of getting a little protective of their jobs, and saying like, hey, we're the ones going out and getting shot at and things like this, running into burning buildings. Why should we share this sort of category with you? But all I could find when I really drilled down into that was just a bunch of police and fire unions and departments who were really vocally in favor of reclassification. I mean, you heard Sania and Jamar from Detroit PD. Jamar himself, as you mentioned, former sworn officer, a decorated officer who then spent time as a 911 telecommunicator. I don't think there's a more authoritative voice bridging the gap than somebody like Jamar, who's able to say, yeah, I was a cop. I spent a long time as a cop out there on the beat, then worked as a telecommunicator, and take it from me, these are both first responder jobs.
You had a scene, which I'm guessing that Sania was a part of and that Jamar was a part of as well, and that was with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. Unsurprisingly, she said, hey, I'm with you guys. You don't have to convince me of anything here. This should be moving through Congress. I don't know why it hasn't. Here's something that was surprising to me, at least, though. Congress isn't the only road. The Office of Management and Budget could reclassify dispatchers on its own. But again, the last review, it was back in 2018. And the next isn't until, 2028. And the Senate passed the bill in September. A companion House version is stuck. We've talked about this. Here's what I want to think about. If it does go through, what actually changes for a dispatcher in Detroit?
That would be up to the Detroit Police Department to sort of consider that. And I think also probably the city of Detroit to consider that change in designation. A lot of cities and states, as I mentioned, would be open to reclassification, but it's actually, without the federal designation, it actually makes it kind of difficult for them to make the change. It's sort of, they have to reach out proactively and like create bills or legislation to do it. Those bills may, they have to pass some sort of, obviously some sort of vote, some sort of vetting process. And so the advocates I spoke to basically said like, many of these places just take their cues from the federal government. They don't have the time or the means or the desire to go out on a limb and be like, well, let's make this exception here. So if the federal government was saying one thing about a labor category, it's very easy, according to the sources I spoke to, for cities to be like, okay, great, we're going to copy you. I'm glad you did this work for us, basically.
All right. So, and this is a point you have brought up already, which is that the federal government really has the opportunity to carve the path, and then cities will follow. Bayard, I want to close on this. You came to this story because of your own 911 call. You were out for a run near your home in Oakland. You saw a brush fire spreading. You called 911 and you got put on hold. Then you kept calling, which experts later told you is exactly the wrong move because it clogs the queue. I'm wondering, after a year inside all of this, what's something about America's 911 system that has really stayed with you?
The people working the phones, honestly. This is a forgotten, underappreciated labor force that's been in crisis, both an understaffing and a mental health crisis, for at least a decade. COVID was an absolute devastation for this workforce. One pattern I saw in my data was essentially, when COVID struck, both staffing levels and answer times almost across the board just plummeted. I imagine it's because, the volume of calls, the traumatic nature of the work, possibly also, people were getting some government money. And so they were like, I'm just going to take some time off here. And the pattern I've seen since the pandemic is essentially these dispatch centers slowly crawling their way out of this hole, this staffing and answer time hole. And some have done better than others. Detroit, I think we should mention, has been hitting the national answer time standard, picking up calls fast enough for a couple of years now. But in other places like where I live in Oakland, they're not hitting the standard. They've missed the mark 11 out of the past 12 years. Other major cities, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Indianapolis, Portland, are all missing the mark by a significant margin. And I think the thing that we forget, probably understandably, is there's another human being on the other side of the phone when we call. We never call 911 to chat with someone. We call it because we need something immediately. And I think the more we can think about the plight of the people on the other side of the phone and treating them with respect, the better off we'll be for this critical service that's run by a critical workforce.
Bayard, thank you for your people-centered reporting. Bayard Duncan is an investigative reporter with Type Investigations. His year inside the country's 911 system aired on the podcast Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. We'll link to the full episode at WDET.org. Bayard, thank you.
Thank you.
It's the Metro on WDET. Up next, stress is a regular part of life for first responders, as we've been discussing. Detroit's firefighters have a surprising way to decompress. We'll find out what that is next here on the Metro.